The air in Marshfield, Missouri on the morning of April 18th, 1880 carried a strange heaviness. It was a Sunday, and the town of roughly 1,500 souls was waking to the promise of spring. The grass had greened along the muddy streets, and the trees that lined the main thoroughfare were beginning to unfurl their leaves. In the small frame houses and brick storefronts, families were preparing for church. The clanging of the bell at the Methodist Episcopal Church would soon call the faithful to morning service. Children were scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best. Men in stiff collars and women in long skirts and bonnets stepped out onto boardwalks, nodding to neighbors. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of quiet morning that seemed to stretch on forever in a small frontier town, but beneath that stillness the atmosphere was wrong. The sky to the southwest had a sickly green tint, a color that older residents would later say they had never seen before. The usual birdsong had gone silent. Even the dogs seemed to sense something, skulking under porches instead of roaming the streets. The air was not just heavy, it was expectant, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Marshfield had been founded only 30 years earlier in 1850 and had grown steadily as a trading center for the surrounding farms. It was the county seat of Webster County, which meant it had a modest courthouse, a few churches, a school, and a handful of general stores. The town's pride was its location along the route of the expanding railroad, which brought visitors and commerce. Life in Marshfield was hard but predictable. People knew the rhythms of the seasons, the planting and harvest, the cold winters and the humid summers. Tornadoes were not unknown in Missouri, but they were rare in these parts. The older settlers remembered stories of twisters that had swept through the plains further west, but here in the Ozarks the hills and valleys seemed to offer protection. On that Sunday morning no one thought of tornadoes. They thought of hymns and roast chicken dinners. By 10 o'clock the sky had grown darker, not with the soft gray of a passing rain cloud, but with a deep bruise-colored purple. The wind picked up, gusting in erratic bursts. A few farmers who had lingered outside to tend to chores looked up and frowned. The wind was warm and damp, almost tropical, and it carried the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic. The leaves on the trees flipped over, showing their pale undersides. The air pressure dropped so sharply that people inside their homes felt their ears pop. Windows rattled in their frames. In the general store on the square, the owner, a man named Hiram Wheeler, stepped out onto the porch and squinted at the sky. He had seen prairie storms before, but this was different. This was a sky that seemed to be rotating. He called to his wife inside, telling her to bring the children down to the cellar. She did not argue. The first sign of real trouble came at about 10:30. A low, continuous roar began to build from the southwest. It was not the rumble of thunder, which comes in waves, but a steady, grinding sound like 1,000 freight trains bearing down at once. People who were inside churches hesitated mid-sermon. Preachers paused, their Bibles open, their eyes fixed on the stained glass windows that suddenly seemed too thin, too fragile. The congregation in the Methodist church heard it first. The preacher, a Reverend John McWhorter, stopped in the middle of a passage from Job and looked at the shaking windows. He said later that he felt the floor tremble under his feet, a vibration that traveled up through the pews and into his bones. He told the people to get down to pray. Some dropped to their knees, others ran for the doors. The tornado that struck Marshfield on that Sunday was later classified as an F5, the most violent category on the modern enhanced Fujita scale. It was not just a funnel cloud. It was a massive black boiling column that seemed to fill half the sky. Eyewitnesses said it looked like a living thing, twisting and writhing as it chewed its way through the countryside. It first touched down about 3 miles southwest of town, where it caught a farmhouse belonging to the Bartlett family. John Bartlett, his wife Mary, and their 5 children had been at breakfast. The tornado lifted the house off its foundation, spun it in the air, and dropped it in pieces across the field. John Bartlett survived, though his leg was broken. His wife and 3 of their children were killed instantly. The other 2 children were thrown clear and found later, dazed and bleeding, in a muddy creek bed. That was the first breath of the storm, the opening note in a symphony of destruction. As the tornado approached Marshfield proper, it widened and intensified. It was now nearly a mile across, a churning wall of debris that included splintered trees, chunks of lumber, pieces of fencing, and the mangled remains of livestock. The roar was deafening. People who survived described it as a sound that did not simply fill the ears but seemed to press against the whole body. It was a physical force, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. In the center of town, the courthouse stood as a sturdy brick building, the pride of Webster County. Its walls were thick, its foundation deep. As the tornado struck, the courthouse swayed like a tree in a gale. The roof peeled off in one piece, lifted straight up, and then vanished into the blackness. The walls buckled inward. Within seconds, the courthouse was reduced to a pile of rubble. The records of the county, the deeds and marriages and wills, were scattered across the countryside, some found days later miles away. The tornado moved northeast through the heart of town, following the line of the main street. It did not discriminate. It struck the general store, the livery stable, the two hotels, the blacksmith shop, and the post office. It picked up a wagon loaded with hay and threw it through the front of the Methodist church, which collapsed seconds later. The steeple, a landmark visible for miles, was snapped off and carried aloft, spinning lazily before crashing down on a house 3 blocks away. The wooden frame homes that lined the side streets were no match for the wind. They were flattened, swept clean from their foundations, their contents strewn across fields and into trees. A grand piano from the parlor of the wealthiest family in town was found later, upside down in a pond 200 yards from where the house had stood. The tornado did not just destroy buildings, it rearranged the landscape. Trees were twisted into spirals or stripped of every branch. The ground itself was scoured, as if a giant hand had raked away the topsoil. The people of Marshfield did the best they could with what little time they had. Some made it to cellars. Others took cover in root cellars or under heavy furniture. A few simply ran, trying to outrun the monster, but there was no outrunning a tornado moving at 60 miles per hour. One man, a farmer named Eli Porter, was caught in the open as he tried to reach his children. He saw the tornado coming and threw himself into a drainage ditch, pressing his face into the mud. The wind passed over him and he felt his clothes being torn from his body. When he looked up, everything was gone. His house, his barn, his fence. But his children had taken shelter in the cellar and they survived. Others were not so fortunate. The tornado picked up a mother and her infant from their front porch and carried them more than a quarter mile. The mother landed in a tree, her back broken. The infant was found alive, still wrapped in a blanket, lying in a field of wildflowers. The storm passed through Marshfield in about 3 minutes. 3 minutes, that is all it took to change the town forever. When the roar faded and the wind died, an eerie silence settled over the wreckage. It was the silence of shock, a profound stillness broken only by the cries of the injured and the weeping of survivors. The sky began to clear and the sun came out, a cruel, bright sun that illuminated the scale of the disaster. Where the courthouse had stood, there was a pile of brick and mortar no higher than a man's waist. The streets were impassable, choked with debris. Bodies lay in the open, covered with sheets and blankets brought by the first responders. The church bells were silent, the steeples were gone. The railroad tracks were twisted into loops and the telegraph poles were snapped like matchsticks. Marshfield was no longer a town, it was a graveyard. The first rescuers came from the surrounding farms and from neighboring settlements. They arrived on foot or on horseback, carrying shovels, axes, and stretchers. They worked through the afternoon and into the night, digging through rubble, searching for survivors. Every so often, a shout would go up and they would pull a child from a collapsed cellar or a woman from under a beam. The injured were taken to makeshift hospitals set up in the few buildings that had escaped the worst of the damage. The dead were laid out in a row on the grass near the railroad depot. By evening, the count was grim. 39 people had been killed in Marshfield alone and more than 60 were seriously injured. The property damage was estimated at $200,000, a staggering sum in 1880, but the number that truly haunted the survivors was the number of children lost. 16 of the dead were under the age of 12. That night, as the stars came out over the ruins, the people of Marshfield began to do what people have always done after catastrophe. They looked for each other. They built fires for warmth and light. They shared what little food and water they had. They held each other and wept. And in the darkness they began to plan. They would rebuild. They had no choice. This was their home, and a tornado, no matter how powerful, could not take that away. But they would never forget the sound of that roar, the green sky, the feeling of the ground shaking under their feet. The memory of April 18th, 1880 would be passed down through generations, a story told on quiet evenings, a warning and a testament to the power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit. As the days passed, word of the disaster spread across the country. Newspapers in St. Louis, Kansas City, and even New York carried the story. Relief trains were dispatched, bringing food, clothing, and medical supplies. The governor of Missouri declared a day of mourning. But for the people of Marshfield, life became a matter of digging out, of burying the dead, of finding the strength to go on. The tornado had taken their homes, their neighbors, their children, but it had not taken their will. In the weeks and months that followed, they rebuilt. They raised a new courthouse, new churches, new schools. They planted new trees. They did not forget, but they moved forward. And the story of the Marshfield tornado became part of the town's identity, a scar that healed but never fully disappeared. The scar that healed but never fully disappeared was one that every resident carried, not just on the land but in their bones. In the weeks after the tornado, the town of Marshfield became a place of raw edges and sudden silences. The work of recovery was relentless. Men who had lost their wives and children worked side by side with men who had lost everything but their own lives, sifting through splintered wood and shattered glass for anything that could be salvaged. A photograph, a child's toy, a wedding ring. These small tokens were lifted from the debris with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. Each found object was a piece of a life that had been torn apart, and to hold it was to hold a memory that the wind could not steal. The dead were buried in a mass grave on a hill overlooking the town. There was no time for individual funerals, not with so many bodies and so many families shattered. The minister from the Methodist Church, who had survived by hiding in the church basement moments before the steeple fell, led a single service for all of them. He stood on a makeshift platform of boards laid over a pile of bricks, his voice cracking as he read from the book of Job. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The crowd of survivors, perhaps 200 people, stood in the rain that had finally begun to fall, a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through their bandages and their borrowed coats. They sang hymns, they wept, and then they turned back to the rubble. Among the survivors was a young woman named Clara Bennett. She had been 17 years old on the morning of the tornado. She had lost her mother, her father, and her two younger brothers. Clara had been thrown into a root cellar when the house collapsed, and she had lain there for hours, pinned under a beam, listening to the screams of the injured and the dying. When the rescuers finally pulled her out, she was covered in bruises and her left arm was broken. She walked away from the wreckage without looking back. She never returned to Marshfield. Years later, she would tell her grandchildren that she simply could not bear to see the place where the sky had turned green and her family had been taken. She moved to Kansas City and became a schoolteacher. She never married. But every year on April 18th, she would take out a small photograph of her family and place it on her mantle. She would light a candle, and she would remember. Other families chose to stay. The Bartleys, whose mother and 3 children had been killed, rebuilt their farm on the same spot. John Bartlett, the father who had survived with a broken leg, became something of a local legend. He was said to have walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he never complained. He remarried a widow who had lost her husband in the storm, and together they raised the 2 children who had survived, the ones found in the creek bed. Those children grew up haunted by the sound of wind. On stormy nights, they would retreat to the root cellar long before any clouds appeared. They knew what the sky could do. The town of Marshfield itself rose again, slowly and with great effort. The new courthouse was built on the same site as the old one, but it was designed with tornado safety in mind. The walls were reinforced and the foundation was sunk deeper into the earth. A storm cellar was dug beneath the building, large enough to hold half the town. The church was rebuilt too, and this time the steeple was not quite so tall. The congregation had decided that a lower steeple might be less inviting to the wind. They did not say it aloud, but everyone understood. They were building differently now. They were building with fear and respect, scarred by what they had seen. The railroad, which had been twisted into wreckage, was repaired within a month. The telegraph lines were restrung, and with the telegraph came news not just of the relief trains but of other storms. That same spring, tornadoes had struck in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. The Weather Service, still in its infancy, began to take notice. A man named John Park Finley, a sergeant in the Signal Corps, had been studying tornadoes for years. He had been trying to convince the government that tornadoes could be predicted, or at least that warnings could be issued. After the Marshfield disaster, his voice gained a new urgency. He traveled to the town, interviewed survivors, measured the path of destruction, and compiled data. He documented the relationship between the green sky and the tornado. He recorded the barometric pressure readings and the wind speeds, though he could only estimate the latter. His reports would eventually lead to the first tornado warning systems, but that was decades away. For now, all he could do was tell the people of Marshfield that they were not alone, that their suffering had not been in vain. The farmers whose fields had been scoured by the wind faced a particular kind of despair. The topsoil had been stripped away, leaving behind a hard, barren crust. It took years for the land to recover. Some farmers simply gave up and moved west to the Dakotas or to Kansas, where the land was cheap and the storms were different. But others stayed and planted cover crops, adding manure and compost to rebuild the soil. They learned to rotate their fields. They planted windbreaks of Osage orange and locust trees. They did not forget the lesson of the tornado, the capriciousness of nature. They became more careful meteorologists themselves, watching the clouds with a keen and practiced eye. One of those farmers was a man named Thomas Holloway. He had been a young boy when the tornado struck. He had survived by clinging to a fence post as the wind tried to rip him away. His family had been spared, but he had seen the body of his neighbor's child lying in the road, and the image had never left him. Thomas grew up to be a quiet, serious man. He became a deacon in the new church and a leader in the community. But he also became something else. He became an amateur student of the weather. He kept a journal recording every thunderstorm, every funnel cloud, every shift in the wind. His journal spanned 60 years. In its pages you can see the evolution of a man learning to read the sky. By the time he died in 1940, the National Weather Service had begun issuing formal tornado warnings, but the people of Marshfield still looked to the sky themselves. They still remembered the green sky. the memory of the tornado entered the oral tradition of Webster County. Grandmothers told the story to their grandchildren and they in turn told it to theirs. The details became fixed, almost mythical. The piano in the pond, the infant found in the wildflowers, the courthouse reduced to rubble in seconds, the preacher who lost his sermon notes and found them weeks later tangled in a tree 5 miles away. The story grew, but it never grew false. It remained anchored in the truth of what had happened, a truth that was passed down not just as a warning but as a testament to endurance. In the early 20th century, the town of Marshfield began to change. New buildings went up. The population grew. The railroad brought new people, new ideas, new ways of living. The old-timers who remembered the tornado would point to the scars on the landscape. Look at that twisted oak tree, they would say. That's where the wind bent it and it never straightened. Or they would show the foundations of the old courthouse still visible in a vacant lot. That's where it all fell. The younger generation listened, but they did not fully understand. The tornado had become a story, not a memory. Then in 1925, a tornado struck again. This one was part of the infamous tri-state tornado outbreak that killed nearly 700 people across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. Marshfield was not hit directly, but the storm passed within a few miles of the town. The sky turned green again. The wind rose. The people who had not been alive in 1880 felt the old fear for the first time. They ran to cellars. They held their children close. And when the storm passed, they emerged to find that the tornado had missed them, but not by much. The experience rekindled the old stories. The grandparents were asked to tell their tales again, and this time the grandchildren listened with a new urgency. They understood now that the story was not just a history lesson. It was a survival guide. By the middle of the 20th century, Marshfield had become a place that took tornado safety seriously. The schools held drills. Every home had a cellar or a designated safe room. The tornado sirens installed in the 1950s were tested every first Tuesday of the month. The children learned not to be frightened by the sound, but to respect it. They knew that the sirens meant the sky might turn green. They knew what had happened in 1880. The scientific understanding of tornadoes advanced dramatically in the decades that followed. The advent of radar, the development of storm spotting networks, and the work of researchers like Ted Fujita transformed meteorology. Fujita himself visited the Midwest in the 1970s, studying the patterns of tornado damage. He might have seen Marshfield in his data, a small town with a big story. By then, the Fujita scale was being used to rate tornadoes. The 1880 storm would likely have been rated an F4, with winds estimated between 207 and 260 miles per hour. That was the power that had flattened the courthouse and carried a piano to a pond. That was the power that had killed 39 people in 3 minutes. But for the people of Marshfield, the ratings and the science were secondary. What mattered was the story. The story of a morning in April when the sky turned green and the world changed forever. The story of a mother and her infant found in the wildflowers. The story of a farmer who lost everything but his will to rebuild. The story of a town that refused to die. As the years passed, the number of survivors dwindled. The last living person who had experienced the tornado firsthand died in 1964. She was an old woman named Margaret O'Neill who had been 5 years old when the storm hit. She had remembered nothing of the tornado itself, only the aftermath, the crying, the dust, the strange silence. She had spent her life telling people that the most important thing was to be ready. "You can never be too ready," she would say. "The sky can change in a minute." On the anniversary of the tornado, the town of Marshfield still holds a small ceremony. A wreath is laid at the monument that stands near the site of the old courthouse. The names of the dead are read aloud. The current mayor gives a short speech. And then at the moment the tornado struck, usually around 11:45 in the morning, the church bells ring. They ring for 3 minutes, 1 minute for each year of the storm's duration. The sound carries across the town, over the rooftops and the fields, a reminder of what happened and a promise that it will not be forgotten. The monument itself is simple, a granite obelisk with the names of the victims carved into its sides. It was dedicated in 1905, paid for by a group of survivors who had pooled their money. Over the years, the stone has weathered. The names are harder to read now, worn by rain and wind, but the town knows them by heart. The Bartletts, the Porters, the Bennetts, the children, the mothers, the fathers, the strangers who were passing through and never made it out. In the local museum, there is a small exhibit dedicated to the tornado. It contains a few artifacts: a twisted piece of railroad track, a shattered teacup, a photograph of the courthouse before and after. There is also a letter written by a survivor to her sister in St. Louis describing the scene. It reads in part, "The houses are gone, the church is gone, my husband is dead and my little girl is missing. But I tell myself I will see her again. I tell myself that God has not left us. The sky was green and now it is blue. I do not know what color it will be tomorrow." The letter is preserved behind glass. Visitors pause in front of it, reading the faded ink. They feel the weight of those words, the grief and the hope tangled together. And they walk away thinking about the sky, about the green sky, about the thin line that separates a normal day from a day that changes everything. The story of the Marshfield Ethel's tornado is not just a story about a storm. It is a story about people. It is about the Bartlett family at breakfast, the farmer in the drainage ditch, the mother clutching her child. It is about the rescuers who dug through the night, the relief trains that arrived with supplies, the governor who declared a day of mourning. It is about the survivors who rebuilt, who planted trees, who taught their children to watch the clouds. And it is about the scar that healed but never fully disappeared. That scar is still there, not just in the land but in the hearts of the people who call Marshfield home. They live with the knowledge that another tornado could come. They accept that risk, but they also live with the knowledge that they have faced the worst that nature can throw at them and they are still standing. The tornado of 1880 is a part of their identity. It is a memory, a lesson, and a legacy. It is the green sky in every dream. It is the roar that never quite fades. And as long as there are people in Marshfield who remember, who tell the story, who listen for the sirens and watch the horizon, that tornado will never truly be a thing of the past. It will live on, passed from generation to generation, a story that warns, that teaches, and that endures. The winds of April 18th, 1880 have long since died. The debris has been cleared, the dead have been buried and mourned. The town has been rebuilt and rebuilt again. But the memory remains, etched into the landscape and into the souls of the people. It is a memory that will not be erased, because it is part of what makes Marshfield Marshfield. It is the scar that healed, the story that never ends, the sky that will always be a little greener for those who know. In the years that followed, the town of Marshfield became something of a living classroom for meteorologists and historians alike. The National Weather Service sent teams to interview the old survivors, to map the damage path, to calculate the wind speeds using the twisted trees and the collapsed walls. They asked questions that the townspeople had never thought to ask. How far did the debris travel? What color was the sky before the tornado touched down? Did the hail fall first or did the wind arrive all at once? The answers were written down, filed away, studied in offices hundreds of miles away. But for the people of Marshfield, the answers were simply the details of a story they had heard 1,000 times. By the 1970s, the last few survivors were in their 90s. They sat on porches on warm spring evenings, watching the clouds drift across the horizon. They spoke little about the tornado unless asked. And when they were asked, their answers were short, almost matter of fact. It was a long time ago, they would say, but I still don't like the way the light looks before a storm. That was the sum of their wisdom. They had learned to read the sky in a way that no textbook could teach. They could feel the pressure change in their bones. They could smell the electricity in the air. They had earned that knowledge with their own flesh and blood. The children of those survivors grew up with the story embedded in their lives. They knew that their grandparents had been heroes or victims or quiet witnesses. They knew that the tornado was not just a historical event but a thread that ran through their family histories. Some of them had inherited the fear. Others had inherited the strength. A few had inherited both, and they carried that weight into their own adulthoods. When they had children of their own, they told the story again, shaping it for a new generation. They did not want the memory to fade. They wanted their children to understand that the world was not always safe, that the ground could shake and the sky could fall, and that survival was not a guarantee but a gift. The tornado also left its mark on the architecture of Marshfield. The town that rose from the rubble was built with a new priority in mind. The homes were constructed with stronger foundations. The roofs were bolted to the frames. The cellars were dug deeper and wider. The public buildings, the schools, the churches, the town hall all had designated shelter areas. The courthouse, when it was finally rebuilt in 1884, was built of brick and stone, with a reinforced basement that could hold the entire town if necessary. The architect had been a man named Ezra Campbell, who had lost his wife and 2 children in the tornado. He had designed the building with his grief as much as his skill. He wanted it to last. He wanted it to stand. And it did. The courthouse still stands today, a quiet monument to resilience. But the most lasting architectural legacy of the tornado was not a single building. It was the way the town was laid out. The streets were widened to reduce the risk of fires spreading. The trees were planted farther apart so that if one fell, it would not take down another. The houses were set back from the road with open spaces between them. The town became a model of storm-friendly planning long before anyone used that term. The farmers who rebuilt their barns and silos did the same. They spaced their buildings out. They anchored their structures deep into the earth. They learned in the hardest possible way that the wind could take anything that was not held fast. The science of tornadoes continued to advance, and Marshfield remained a point of reference. In the 1980s, a team from the University of Oklahoma visited the town to study the damage patterns of the 1880 storm. They used computer models to simulate the wind fields. They compared the destruction to that of modern tornadoes. They concluded that the Marshfield tornado was likely a multiple vortex event, meaning that instead of a single funnel, the storm had contained several smaller vortices rotating around a common center. That explained why some patches of land were completely devastated while others just a few feet away seemed untouched. It explained why the piano had been carried to the pond while the house itself had been shredded. The tornado had not been a single blow. It had been a storm within a storm. The discovery fascinated the people of Marshfield. They had always known that the tornado was strange, capricious, almost intelligent in its destruction. Now they had a name for it, they had a scientific explanation, but the explanation did not change the story. It only added another layer. The grandparents who had survived the storm had known without any training in meteorology that the tornado was not a simple thing. They had seen the way it danced. They had felt the way it twisted. They had watched it kill some and spare others without rhyme or reason. The science confirmed what they had always known, but it could not replace the knowledge born of experience. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, Marshfield continued to grow. The town expanded, new subdivisions went up, new families moved in. Some of them had never heard of the 1880 tornado. They had come from places where tornadoes were not a part of life. They were surprised at first by the sirens that blared every first Tuesday of the month. They were confused by the cellars that were standard in every older home. They were curious about the monument in the center of town, the obelisk with the worn names. And then they were told the story. They listened as the old-timers had listened before them. Some of them were moved, others shrugged it off, calling it ancient history, but the story did not care whether they believed it. The story was patient. It waited. And then in 2012, another tornado struck the area. It was not as powerful as the one in 1880. It was rated an EF2 with winds of around 130 miles per hour. It touched down about 10 miles south of Marshfield, tearing through farmland and destroying a few barns and grain silos. No one was killed, but the sky turned green that day. The people of Marshfield saw it. They felt the dread rising in their chests. They did not panic, but they moved quickly. They went to their cellars. They turned on the radio. They listened to the warnings. And when the storm passed, they emerged to find that their town was safe, but the fear had returned. It had never really left. The next day, the local newspaper ran a story comparing the two tornadoes. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins who had grown up in Marshfield, interviewed the oldest residents she could find. She asked them what they remembered about the 1880 tornado, even though they had not been alive then. She asked them how the town had changed. She asked them what it felt like to see the sky turn green, knowing what that color meant. The answers she received were not dramatic. The old people did not speak in grand pronouncements. They spoke in small truths. "I just go to the cellar," one of them said. "I don't think about it. I just go, that's what I was taught, that's what I do." Sarah Jenkins wrote a piece that was picked up by the state news wires. It told the story of the 1880 tornado and its legacy. It mentioned the monument, the annual ceremony, the letter in the museum. It quoted Margaret O'Neill's final interview recorded in 1963, "You cannot outrun the wind, you cannot outsmart it, you can only be ready." The article ended with a simple line, "The sky will turn green again." The question is not if but when. The article struck a chord. It was shared online. It was read in classrooms. It inspired a group of students from the local high school to create a documentary about the tornado. They interviewed the descendants of the survivors. They filmed the monument at sunrise. They visited the museum and zoomed in on the faded names. They learned about the Bartletts, the Porters, the Bennetts. They learned about the farmer in the drainage ditch and the mother in the wildflowers. They learned that the story was not just about death and destruction. It was about survival and memory. It was about a town that had been broken and had chosen to heal. The documentary was shown at the town hall on the anniversary of the tornado, 132 years after the storm. The room was full. People who had never met the survivors, who had only heard the story secondhand, sat in silence as the images flickered on the screen. At the end, there was no applause. There was only a long, quiet moment. And then someone began to cry. It was a woman in her 40s, a mother of two. She had moved to Marshfield 5 years earlier and had never really thought about the tornado. But watching the documentary, seeing the faces of the descendants, hearing the old recordings, she felt something shift inside her. She understood now. She understood that she was part of the story, whether she had chosen to be or not. She was living in a town that had been shaped by a storm. She was raising children under a sky that could turn green at any moment. She was part of that long chain of people who had come before and would come after. She was a link. That night after the screening, she went home and told her children the story. She did not spare them the details. She told them about the broken bodies and the shattered buildings. She told them about the green sky and the roar. She told them about the mother and the infant, about the farmer in the ditch, about the piano in the pond. She told them about the bravery of the rescuers and the kindness of the strangers. She told them that the world could be violent, but that people could be strong. And when she was done, her oldest child, a boy of 10, looked at her and said, "So what do we do when the sky turns green?" She looked at him. She felt the weight of the question. She remembered the words of Margaret O'Neill. She said, "We go to the basement, we stay calm, we wait for the storm to pass, and then we come out and we help each other. That is what we do, that is what we have always done." The boy nodded, he understood, he had heard the story, he would tell it to his own children someday, and the story would continue. The documentary had planted a seed. In the weeks that followed, the woman who had cried, her name was Laura, found herself thinking about the story constantly. She began to research the tornado on her own, spending hours at the library and the museum. She read the old newspaper articles, squinting at the faded type. She listened to the recordings of Margaret O'Neill, the crackling voice of a woman who had been a child when the sky turned green. She learned the names of every victim, every survivor, every rescuer. She memorized the list of the dead, recited it to herself like a prayer. The names became familiar, like the names of neighbors she had never met. Laura's obsession did not go unnoticed. Her husband, Tom, a quiet man who worked at the hardware store, watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. He had grown up in Marshfield, had heard the story 100 times, but he had never felt the weight of it the way Laura did. One evening, as she was reading an account of the funeral procession, he asked her why she was so consumed by something that had happened 130 years ago. Laura put down the book and looked at him. She said, "Because it's not something that happened 130 years ago. It's something that's still happening. It's in the ground. It's in the air. It's in the way we build our houses and the way we plan our lives. We are still living in the aftermath of that storm. We always will be." Tom did not argue. He walked over to the window and looked out at the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. He thought about his own grandfather, a man who had never talked about the tornado but had built his house with a cellar so deep you had to descend a ladder to reach it. He thought about how that cellar was still there, under the house he now lived in with Laura and their children. He had never thought of it as anything more than a storage space. Now he saw it differently. It was a monument. It was a gift from a generation that had known fear and had chosen to prepare. That night, Tom went down into the cellar for the first time in years. He took a flashlight and swept the beam across the walls. The cellar was dry and cool. There were old jars of preserves on the shelves, a few boxes of Christmas decorations, a dusty bicycle. But there was also a small wooden bench against the far wall, and above it, nailed to a beam, a faded piece of paper. Tom held the flashlight close and read the words, written in pencil, in a shaky hand. "We took shelter here on the day the wind came. April 10th, 1880, my wife and my 5 children, we heard the roar, we felt the house shake, but we were safe, God be praised, John Porter." Tom's breath caught. He had never seen that note before. He had never known that his grandfather had written it. He called for Laura to come down. She descended the ladder and stood beside him. Together, they read the note. Laura reached out and touched the paper, as if she could feel the hand that had written it. She said he wanted someone to find this. He wanted the story to survive. Tom nodded. He felt a connection to his grandfather that he had never felt before. He was no longer just a man living in a house with a cellar. He was the keeper of a story. He was part of the chain. The discovery of John Porter's note became a local sensation. The museum sent a curator to examine it. It was preserved in a glass case placed next to the original letter from the survivor in St. Louis. People came from neighboring towns to see it. They stood in front of the case and read the words, imagining the fear and the faith that had inspired them. The note was used as a teaching tool in the schools. Children learned that history was not just in textbooks, it was in their own basements. It was in the walls of their homes. It was waiting to be discovered. Laura and Tom became active in the Marshfield Historical Society. They helped organize a new exhibit about the tornado, including interactive elements that allowed visitors to hear the recordings, to see the maps, to understand the science. Laura gave talks at the local library. She spoke about the importance of memory. She said, "We cannot prevent the storms, but we can remember them. We can honor the past by preparing for the future. And we can find strength in the stories of those who came before us." Meanwhile, the science of tornadoes continued to evolve. In 2015, a team from the National Weather Service visited Marshfield as part of a study on long-term tornado climatology. They wanted to understand how the 1880 storm fit into the larger pattern of severe weather in the region. They used modern radar data and historical records to reconstruct the conditions that had led to the outbreak. They found that the atmosphere on April 10, 1880, had been remarkably similar to the atmosphere on days when major tornado outbreaks occurred in the 20th and 21st centuries. There was a strong low-pressure system, a warm and humid air mass, and a powerful jet stream. The ingredients were classic. The storm had been a product of the same forces that still produce tornadoes today. The lead meteorologist, a woman named Dr. Emily Hart, gave a presentation at the Marshfield Community Center. She talked about what they had learned. She showed slides of the storm's path overlaid on a modern map. She explained that the tornado had likely been an F5 on the Fujita scale, with winds exceeding 260 miles per hour. She noted that such storms were rare but not unprecedented. She said that the 1880 tornado was a reminder that severe weather could strike anywhere at any time. She urged the community to stay vigilant, to have a plan, to practice their drills. The audience listened quietly. They had heard this message before. But hearing it from a scientist with charts and data made it feel more real. After the presentation, a man raised his hand. He was elderly with a weathered face and a slow voice. He said, "Dr. Hart, my grandmother survived that tornado. She was a little girl. She told me that the sky turned green and then there was a sound like 1,000 trains. Is that what the science says?" Dr. Hart smiled. She said, "Your grandmother was right. The green sky is caused by the scattering of light through the storm's hail and rain. The roar comes from the tornado's interaction with the ground. The human ear can detect it, even if the mind cannot fully comprehend it. Your grandmother knew the truth of the storm, even without a degree." The man nodded. He said, "Thank you. That means a lot." The conversation after the lecture was lively. People shared their own family stories. They compared notes. They realized that many of them had ancestors who had been in the storm. Some had never known. It was a night of discovery and connection. Laura and Tom stood in the back listening. They felt a sense of purpose. They had helped bring the community together. They had helped keep the story alive. As the years passed, the monument in the center of town underwent a renovation. The names that had worn away were re-engraved. The obelisk was cleaned and sealed. A new plaque was added honoring the rescuers and the helpers, the ones who had come from distant towns to offer aid. The annual ceremony grew larger. It became a day of remembrance and also a day of preparedness. The fire department hosted a safety fair. The Red Cross offered first aid classes. The schools held tornado drills. The town turned its history into a living practice, and the children grew up knowing the story. Laura's son, the boy who had asked what to do when the sky turned green, became a teenager. He joined the documentary club at school and helped create a follow-up film focusing on the science behind the storm. He interviewed Dr. Hart, who came back to Marshfield for a special screening. He interviewed his mother and his father. He interviewed the oldest residents, the ones who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told them. He compiled everything into a film that was shown at the State History Conference. He won an award, but more importantly, he understood. He carried the story forward. On the 150th anniversary of the tornado in 2030, the town held a grand commemoration. Descendants of the survivors came from across the country. Some had never visited Marshfield before. They walked the streets trying to imagine what it had been like. They visited the museum, where the note from John Porter was still on display, its pencil lines still visible. They visited the cemetery, where the graves of the victims were decorated with flowers. They gathered at the monument, and a local historian read the names of the dead one by one. The list took over an hour, but no one left. They stood in silence, honoring the memory. Laura, now in her 60s, stood in the crowd with Tom and their son, who was now a young man with a family of his own. Laura looked up at the sky. It was a clear blue with not a cloud in sight, but she knew that could change in an instant. She knew that the sky could turn green, that the wind could rise, that the world could be turned upside down. That knowledge lived in her bones now. It was not a fear, it was a truth, and she accepted it. When the ceremony ended, a young girl approached Laura. She was about 10, the same age Laura's son had been when he asked the question. The girl said, "Excuse me, I heard you tell the story of the tornado. My grandmother told me about it too. She said you knew the right thing to do." Laura knelt down to look the girl in the eye. She said, "What is your grandmother's name?" The girl said, "Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She wrote the article in the newspaper a long time ago." Laura smiled. She remembered Sarah Jenkins, the reporter who had interviewed the old people and written the piece that had started it all. She said, "Your grandmother is very wise. And yes, I know the right thing to do. When the sky turns green, you go to the cellar, you wait. And then you help each other. That is what we do. That is what we have always done." The girl nodded. She said, "I will remember." And Laura knew that she would. The story would continue, passed from generation to generation, carried by the wind of memory. The sky would turn green again, but the people of Marshfield would be ready. They had been ready for 150 years. They would be ready for 150 more. And so the story goes on, not as a relic of the past, but as a living part of the present. The tornado of 1880 is not just a historical event. It is a teacher. It is a warning. It is a bond that ties together everyone who calls Marshfield home. The green sky is a memory that will never fade, a signal that pulses through the blood of the town. And every time the sirens sound, every time the cellar doors swing open, every time a child asks what to do, the story is reborn. The wind will always come, but so will the courage, so will the kindness, so will the quiet strength of a community that has learned in the hardest possible way that the only way to face the storm is together. That is the lesson of the Marshfield tornado. That is the legacy. And that is the story that will never end. And so the story goes on not as a relic of the past, but as a living part of the present. The tornado of 1880 is not just a historical event, it is a teacher, it is a warning, it is a bond that ties together everyone who calls Marshfield home. The green sky is a memory that will never fade, a signal that pulses through the blood of the town. And every time the sirens sound, every time the cellar doors swing open, every time a child asks what to do, the story is reborn. The wind will always come, but so will the courage, so will the kindness, so will the quiet strength of a community that has learned in the hardest possible way that the only way to face the storm is together. That is the lesson of the Marshfield tornado, that is the legacy, and that is the story that will never end. But legacies are not static. They breathe and shift with each passing year. In the decade that followed the 150th anniversary, the town began to notice something unexpected. The memory of the tornado was no longer just a thing of the past. It had become a part of the town's identity in a way that drew people to it. Tourists came not just for the annual ceremony but for the history itself. They walked the path of the tornado, following a map that the Historical Society had created. They stopped at the markers where houses had once stood, where families had huddled, where lives had been lost and saved. They listened to the audio guide recorded by Laura's son, now a grown man with a voice as calm and steady as his mother's. They heard the story in his words and they felt it in their bones. One such visitor was a young couple from Kansas, a state that knew tornadoes as well as any place on Earth. They had driven 5 hours just to see Marshfield. The husband, a storm chaser by hobby, had read about the 1880 tornado in a book. He wanted to stand on the ground where an F5 had torn through a town that was barely a village. His wife, a teacher, wanted to understand how a community could rebuild after such a catastrophe. They spent a weekend walking the streets, talking to residents, visiting the museum. On their last day, they sat on a bench near the monument, looking at the obelisk that held the names of the dead. The husband said, "I've chased storms all over the plains. I've seen the aftermath, but I've never seen a place that carries the memory like this. It's like the tornado is still here somehow." His wife nodded. "It's not about the destruction," she said. "It's about what they did after. That's what matters." They left Marshfield with a new understanding. They went home and started a project in their own community, a program that paired historical remembrance with modern preparedness. They called it the Legacy of the Sky, and it spread to towns across the Midwest. Marshfield became a model, a place where the past was not a curse but a guide. Other towns sent delegations to learn how to keep their own tornado stories alive. They studied the museum, the monument, the annual ceremony. They interviewed Laura and Tom and the other elders. They took notes and went home to implement their own versions. The word of Marshfield's example traveled far. Meanwhile, the climate began to change in ways that made the old lessons even more urgent. Scientists published studies showing that severe weather was becoming more frequent and more intense. The same patterns that had produced the 1880 tornado were appearing more often. Tornado seasons were lengthening. Storms were shifting eastward into regions that had never considered themselves at high risk. The green sky became a symbol of a new reality, one that demanded vigilance from everyone, not just those in the traditional tornado alley. The people of Marshfield felt a strange mix of sorrow and validation. They had known this truth for 150 years. Now the rest of the world was catching up. In 2041, a tornado struck a town in Indiana that had no cellars, no sirens, no drills. The death toll was high. The news coverage was relentless. And in the midst of the tragedy, reporters noticed something. The town of Marshfield, Missouri had sent a team of volunteers. They came with food, water, chainsaws, and a calm efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. They had trained for this. They had practiced for this. They knew exactly what to do because they had been preparing for a storm that had already happened. The volunteers worked side by side with the survivors, clearing debris, setting up shelters, listening to stories. They did not lecture. They did not preach. They simply helped. And when they left behind a copy of the 1880 museum exhibit, packed in a crate, along with a note that said, "This is your story now, keep it, use it." The gesture made national news. A journalist wrote a piece titled "The Town That Remembered," and it was shared millions of times. Marshfield became a symbol of resilience in a time of climate anxiety. People wrote letters to the Historical Society. They sent donations. They asked how they could start their own memory projects. The little town in the Ozarks, once nearly erased from history, became a beacon. Laura watched all of this from her porch, now in her late 70s, gray-haired and slow-moving but with eyes that still sparkled. She had long since retired from the Historical Society, but she remained its honorary matriarch. Young people came to her to ask for advice. She told them the same thing she had told her son and the same thing she had told the girl at the monument. When the sky turns green, you go to the cellar. You wait and then you help each other. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Laura received a call. It was her son now living in Oklahoma with his own family. He had a daughter, Laura's granddaughter, who was 9 years old. The girl had been asking questions about the tornado. She had seen the documentary her father had made. She had memorized the names on the monument. She wanted to know what it felt like to stand in the green light. Laura took a deep breath. She said, "Put her on the phone." A small voice came through the speaker. "Grandma, is it true you were there when they found the note from John Porter?" Laura smiled. "Not exactly, sweetheart. I saw it in the museum, but I know the story. Your great-great-grandmother told me about it." "Can you tell me?" Laura looked out the window. The sky was clear, a deep blue fading to purple at the horizon. She thought of all the times she had told this story. She thought of Sarah Jenkins, the reporter who had started it all. She thought of John Porter, the man who had written the note, who had given his last words to the world. She thought of the children, the families, the rescuers, the helpers. She thought of the wind and the silence that followed. She thought of the green sky. "Yes," she said, "I can tell you." It was a spring day just like this one a long time ago. The air was warm and still. The birds were quiet, and then the sky turned green. She began the story as she had done so many times before. Her voice was soft but steady. The words flowed like a river that had been flowing for 150 years. The little girl on the other end of the line listened without interruption, her breath held, her heart beating in time with the tale. And when Laura finished, there was a long silence. "Grandma," the girl whispered, "I think I understand." Laura nodded, even though her granddaughter could not see her. "Good," she said. "Now you have to tell someone else. That's how it works. You tell the story and it stays alive." "I will," the girl said, and Laura knew she would. The story would continue, passed from voice to voice, from generation to generation, carried not by the wind, but by the people who refused to let it die. The sky would turn green again, the wind would rise. The world would be turned upside down, but the people of Marshfield would be ready. They had been ready for 160 years. They would be ready for 160 more. And so the story goes on. It will never end. It lives in every cellar door, every siren test, every child's question. It lives in the monument, in the museum, in the annual ceremony. It lives in the hearts of those who have heard it and those who will hear it. The tornado of 1880 was a moment of destruction, but it became a moment of creation. It forged a community that knew in its deepest bones that the only way to face the storm is together. That is the truth. That is the legacy. And that is the story that will be told for as long as there are people to tell it.